there is a date that sits quietly in the official record of post-war Germany. A date that almost no one discusses. Not in classrooms, not in documentaries, not in the polished press releases that came out of Berlin during one of the most watched moments in modern history. The fall of the wall. The reunification. The return of a capital. And yet, buried beneath all of that celebration, something was found. Something that the people who found it apparently decided the rest of the world did not need to know about. We are talking about 1990. We are talking about the Reichstag. And we are talking about foundations in the ground that should not exist. But before we get into what was found, let us talk about what was expected. Because the gap between those two things is where the real story lives. The Reichstag building is one of the most photographed structures in all of Europe. It is the seat of the German parliament, the Bundestag. And it carries the weight of an entire century's worth of catastrophe and survival. Most people know it from the images. The glass dome. The ramps spiraling upward. Tourists looking down through the transparent floor at the politicians below. Architect Norman Foster gave Germany a symbol of transparency in the 1990s, and the world applauded. The narrative was clean. The narrative was hopeful. Germany was looking forward. But what happens when the ground beneath a symbol of openness is hiding something? What happens when the very act of preparing that building for its new democratic future accidentally uncovered a layer of history that no one had planned for? And that no one, apparently, they wanted to discuss. This is the question that sits at the center of the Reichstag file. And the more carefully you examine what archaeologists actually found during those excavations, the harder it becomes to accept the silence that followed. The official history of the Reichstag building begins in 1884. That is the year construction started. The architect was Paul Wallot, a 36-year-old from Frankfurt am Main, who had won a prestigious competition to design the new parliamentary home of the recently unified German Empire. His vision was enormous. Neo-Renaissance style, massive corner towers, ornate facades, and crowning it all, a great glass and iron dome meant to signal power, modernity, and ambition all at once. 10 years of construction. 25,000 cubic meters of masonry. The 4,000 tons of iron just for the dome structure. The official cost came to approximately 24 million gold marks. Adjusted for today, somewhere around $400 million. By 1894, Kaiser Wilhelm II was attending the opening ceremony. The Federal Archives contain thousands of pages. Plans, cost breakdowns, engineering decisions. Standard concrete foundations reaching down approximately 4 meters into the Berlin soil, as would be appropriate for a building of this size. Everything documented, everything filed. Except those files begin, almost without exception, at the moment the first shovel went into the ground in 1884. They do not tell you what was there before. And when archaeologists arrived in 1990, that omission would become impossible to ignore. The context matters. Germany had just been reunified. The Berlin would again serve as the capital, and the Reichstag, that scarred, fire-damaged, war-battered building, would be transformed into the new home of the Bundestag. Norman Foster was brought in to lead the architectural transformation. His team's vision required a complete structural evaluation. Before anything new could be added, you had to understand exactly what you were building on top of. So the archaeologists from the Berlin State Office for Monument Protection arrived. Their task was described officially as routine documentation work. They expected to find the foundations that Wallot had laid in the 1880s. They expected to confirm what the existing plans already showed. 4 meters down, standard construction, no surprises. What they found instead created a crisis that was apparently resolved very quickly, very quietly, and very completely. As the dig progressed on the northern side of the building, the teams passed through the expected layers of Wallot's 19th century construction and kept going. 5 meters. 6. 7. The soil became denser, colder. At 8 meters, the texture of what they were hitting changed entirely. No longer concrete and brick rubble of the late 1800s. What they were hitting now was something else entirely. Massive blocks of natural stone. Precisely cut. Laid with a tightness and care that spoke not of industrial-era construction, but of something far older. The archaeologists stopped and looked more carefully. They took samples. They documented the mortar between the stone joints. A lime-based mortar, not the cement-based compounds that had replaced it by Wallot's era. The tool marks on the stone itself belonged to techniques not used in the 1800s. The geological origin of the stone was different from the sandstone used on the Reichstag's facades. The radiocarbon analysis of organic material embedded in the mortar came back with a date that silenced the room, somewhere between 1620 and 1640. The dead center of the 30 Years' War. These stone foundations sitting beneath the foundations of the German parliament were placed in the ground roughly 250 years before Paul Wallot ever drew a single line. And the foundations did not stop there. They went down to 12 meters, 3 times as deep as the Reichstag building itself required. The question that emerges from this is not a small one. What kind of structure, built in 17th century Berlin, required foundations descending 12 meters into the ground? For comparison, the Berlin City Palace, the most powerful building in the city at the time, sat on foundations of approximately 5 to 7 meters. The great churches of Berlin, the Nikolaikirche and the Marienkirche, went about 4 to 6 meters down. Even the most ambitious defensive structures of the era, fortifications built to withstand cannon fire, did not routinely exceed 8 meters. 12 meters has a different logic. 12 meters suggests that the point was the depth itself. That what mattered was not what was being held up, but what was being accessed or protected below the surface. And then there were the tunnels. The excavation reports, buried in bureaucratic archives under labels that make no mention of any unusual discovery. Describe what teams found when they followed the edges of those older foundations. Sealed passages, bricked-up openings, the beginnings of tunnel systems, some partially collapsed, others deliberately filled with rubble. Their directions, as far as investigators could determine, pointed in 2 primary orientations. One set appeared to angle eastward, toward the Brandenburg Gate, roughly 700 meters away. Another set appeared to run toward what would later become Potsdamer Platz, about 1.5 kilometers to the south. The historical problem here is significant. In 1884, when the Reichstag was built, the Potsdamer Platz area was barely developed. The Brandenburg Gate had been standing since 1791. But why would any 19th century parliamentary building need a secret tunnel to a decorative city gate? And if the tunnels were older, from the 17th century, then the question becomes stranger still. But Berlin in 1620 was a completely different city. So where did these tunnels lead, and why? The archaeologists brought the information to their supervisors. The Berlin State Office for Monument Protection informed the Federal Building Authority. Meetings were held. A decision was reached quickly. The findings would be documented, measured, photographed, and then sealed. Covered over. The renovation timeline would not be disrupted. Berlin was supposed to become a capital again. And an archaeological puzzle of this magnitude one that could trigger years of additional investigation and mandatory preservation hearings, was not something that the moment could accommodate. The reports were filed. They were cataloged. But they were not published in any form that would draw attention. They were not announced at a press conference. They landed in folders labeled something along the lines of routine excavation, Reichstag, 1990 through 1996. A historian who did not already know to look for them would likely never find them. This pattern is worth sitting with because it raises an uncomfortable possibility. The silence was not accidental. The silence was chosen. There are questions worth asking about the dating itself. The radiocarbon method has margins of error. Lime mortar can absorb atmospheric carbon in ways that potentially skew results. Could there be an innocent explanation for what the analysis showed? It is worth noting, however, that the samples were tested multiple times. The tool marks on the stone were analyzed independently. The type of limestone used in the mortar production was examined for its burning characteristics. All of these separate lines of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Construction techniques and materials consistent with early 17th century Berlin. The architectural question that follows is this: what kind of building would a 17th century architect have designed requiring 12-meter deep foundations in a city that was, at the time, not even the dominant metropolis in the region? One framework involves the military logic of the early Prussian state. The man who ruled Brandenburg Prussia during this era was Frederick William, the Great Elector. Obsessed with security after watching his region get torn apart during the 30 Years' War, he rebuilt Berlin with defensive infrastructure as a central priority. It is not unreasonable to suggest that underground passages connecting key military and administrative sites would have appealed to a ruler of that disposition. If such a system existed, it might have been classified at the highest level, with records deliberately destroyed after completion. Workers could have been kept isolated from one another to prevent any single person from grasping the full scope of the network. But this framework has a problem. Military projects in Prussia were, in general, meticulously documented. Every barrel of gunpowder, every cartload of stone, every day's wages for every laborer. These things left traces in the archives. A project of this magnitude, involving massive quantities of cut stone dropped deep into the Berlin soil at multiple locations along a roughly east-west axis. These would have consumed enormous resources. And yet there appears to be no corresponding record of that expenditure anywhere in the relevant period. Which either means the records were deliberately and comprehensively removed, or the project was funded and managed through channels that left no paper trail at all. The second possibility is structurally more radical. What if the site of the Reichstag was not simply an empty field before 1884? Historical maps of Berlin from the 19th century show the area as largely undeveloped. Training grounds, grass, scattered sheds. But when you go back further, to 18th century cartography, something less definitive appears. Vague notations referring to royal construction yards or military installations, without any detail about what was inside or below those structures. Well, if there was a significant structure on that site before the 19th century, something demolished or absorbed rather than simply cleared, then Wallot may have known about the foundations he was building on top of. Any competent architect preparing to build a major government building would have ordered soil surveys. Those surveys in 1884 would have gone deep enough to encounter what the archaeologists in 1990 found. And yet Wallot's official documentation contains no mention of older structures, no notation of pre-existing foundations, no record of obstacles encountered during the early dig phase. That absence is itself a kind of evidence. Not proof of anything specific. But the kind of silence that, once noticed, does not easily go away. There is another layer to this that extends beyond the Reichstag building itself. When you trace a line from the site of the old Berlin City Palace, the center of Prussian power before it was demolished by East Germany in 1950, through the Brandenburg Gate and continuing westward to the Reichstag, you find that all three of these structures sit on a nearly straight east-west axis. And all three have documented anomalies in their foundations. The Berlin City Palace, before its demolition, was surveyed in detail by architects hoping to record it for a potential future reconstruction. Those surveys, which still exist in the archives of the Berlin State Office for Monument Protection, show foundations beneath the main tower reaching 14 meters down. The same surveys noted passages in the basement levels described as storage rooms, but which had no conventional doors and could only be accessed through vertical shafts. The documented exit points of some of those passages pointed west, toward the general direction of the Brandenburg Gate, and beyond it, the Reichstag site. The Brandenburg Gate, during restoration work in 2002, was found by construction crews to have foundations reaching 8 meters down, considerably deeper than its structural load would require for a purely decorative city gateway. Beneath one of the eastern pillars, workers found a sealed vault, approximately 2 meters in diameter, deliberately filled with rubble. When the filling was removed, the chamber extended approximately 5 meters in an eastward direction before ending abruptly. It had not collapsed. It had been professionally sealed, made intentionally impassable. 3 buildings, 1 axis, foundations deeper than their structural requirements demand, sealed passages at the base of each, documented but never publicly connected. The question is not whether these things exist. They are recorded, some of them in publicly accessible archives. The question is whether the pattern they form is coincidence or the visible edge of something much larger that has been waiting a very long time for someone to look directly at it. And here is the detail about Norman Foster's glass dome, the one that became the defining image of the new, transparent, democratic Germany. Foster gave an interview in 2000 in the architecture journal Bauwelt. He spoke about the philosophy behind the dome's design, about light and shadow, about the relationship between the structure above and the people below. And in the middle of that conversation, he said something that, in this context, stops you cold. He described the dome as integrating the old and creating the new. The old. Not the old Wallot-era building that had been gutted and rebuilt from the inside. Not the World War II damage that was repaired. The old as in something that was already there. Something that Foster's team had to work around. Something that shaped decisions about what the new construction could look like. The floor plan of the Reichstag is not a perfect rectangle. There are unexplained asymmetries, unusual projections, slight shifts in the building's internal axes. These irregularities are typically attributed to practical adjustments made during original construction. But buildings designed in the historicist tradition that Wallot worked within are supposed to be geometrically deliberate. The asymmetries most often arise when an architect is not building freely on open ground, but is obligated to conform to something that already exists beneath the surface. What was there below the Reichstag that shaped the decisions of two architects separated by over a century? The honest answer is that certainty is not available here. What is available is a set of documented anomalies that do not fit comfortably within the official explanations offered for them. The existence of those anomalies is not in serious dispute among the small number of researchers who have studied the excavation reports directly. What is in dispute is what they mean. The foundations are older than the building above them that appears to be established. The tunnels appear to have existed, that also appears to be documented. Not the silence that followed their discovery was not random. Decisions were made about how to file, label, and not publicize those findings. That too is documented. What is not established is the ultimate purpose of what was built in the early 17th century on and around that site. It could be the remnant of a Prussian military infrastructure network, deliberately classified and then forgotten as the political configurations of Berlin shifted over centuries. It could be something even older. The footprint of a structure whose existence was inconvenient to the nationalist historical narrative that 19th century Germany was trying to construct for itself. Or it could be something that none of the currently available frameworks can adequately describe. Because the records that would clarify it were systematically removed at some point between the 17th century and today. Millions of people have walked up that spiral ramp, looked out over the city, and felt for a moment that they were standing at the center of something transparent, something accountable, something built on solid and knowable ground. The evidence suggests the ground may be considerably less knowable than any of us have been led to believe. Berlin was reunified. A building was renovated. And somewhere in that process, the archaeologists put down their brushes, filed their reports in folders that nobody reads, and the glass dome went up, shining, beautiful, pointed toward the sky. The question of what lies 12 meters beneath it was never officially asked. It was simply decided at some level, that the question was inconvenient. That is not how history is supposed to work. And it is not how we intend to leave it. If this file opened something for you, if it left you with questions that the official record refuses to answer, then this channel exists for exactly that reason. Every week, we go back into the parts of the past that were quietly closed off, and we ask the questions that did not make it into the textbooks. Hit subscribe. Leave your theory in the comments. And share this with one person who still believes everything they were taught in school.